Welcome to Mild History, dear listener. You are safe, and you are, for now, somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. Before we begin, take a moment to notice the weight of the pillow beneath your head, the quiet rhythm of your breath, and the distant hum of the world beyond this room. And now, let us travel backward, slowly, to a century when stone walls were thick, candles were precious, and silence was considered a form of devotion. Sister Agnes of Wexford was not a famous woman. She did not invent a new theology, nor did she perform miracles, nor lead armies, nor even keep especially neat records. Yet, in the quiet corridors of St. Æthelflæd's convent, she managed, through an odd combination of stubbornness, distraction, and mild disregard for protocol, to earn across generations of monastic gossip the whispered title of the worst nun in England. It was not that she was cruel or wicked, she was simply difficult to supervise. The convent itself sat on a low rise near a stream that never quite managed to become a river. The land around it was good for onions and for sheep. The walls were built of uneven gray stone, patched here and there with lighter, newer blocks where the frost had bitten too deeply. Inside, the air smelled faintly of beeswax, damp wool, and the sweet tang of smoke from peat fires that never seemed to go out completely. Each morning, before the first hint of dawn, a single bell was rung by whichever novice had drawn the short straw. It was not a pleasant sound, more a cracked metal complaint than a chime. The sisters rose from their straw mattresses, pulled their habits tighter against the cold, and made their slow procession to the chapel. Sister Agnes was usually among the last. She moved at what could generously be described as a reflective pace. When she knelt, she did so with great ceremony, perhaps to disguise the fact that she had only half memorized that morning's psalms. The chanting began, Latin phrases drifted upward into the rafters, and then downward again, landing softly on the bowed heads like dust. It was, in its own way, soothingly repetitive. By mid-morning, the convent came to life. There were chores to be done, as there always were. Sister Agnes was assigned to the herb garden, not because she was especially skilled, but because, years earlier, she had shown a fleeting interest in the names of plants. The garden was walled on 3 sides and open on the 4th, where a small orchard began. In spring, it was pleasant. In winter, it was something else entirely. She grew rue and sage, wormwood, feverfew, and mint, though she frequently confused one for another when labeling the drying racks. Once, an unfortunate confusion between valerian and nettle resulted in a tincture that caused mild itching among the infirmary's patients. It was not a catastrophe, merely inconvenient. The abbess sighed, crossed herself, and reassigned Agnes to candle-making for a month. Candle-making, however, proved no better. The wax had to be melted,
poured and cooled with precise timing, and Sister Agnes had never been precise about anything. Her candles leaned to one side like weary soldiers. Some burned too quickly, others refused to burn at all. Yet, because candle wax was valuable, nothing was wasted. Bent candles were straightened by warming them over coals. The ones that refused to burn were melted again and again until they consented. The whole process took hours, and the smell, half honey, half smoke, lingered in her hair long after Compline. The rule of Saint Benedict dictated a strict balance between prayer, labor, and study. For some, this balance was a comfort. For Sister Agnes, it was a puzzle she never quite solved. She found herself lost between the hours, often forgetting whether it was time for terce or sext. More than once, she appeared in the refectory when she ought to have been in the scriptorium. The other nuns would look up briefly, nod, and return to their bowls of lentil stew. Routine errors had become part of her presence. In the scriptorium, she was meant to copy devotional texts. Her handwriting, however, was legible only to those with imagination. She would begin with confidence, crisp strokes, even spacing, but as the hours passed, her letters slumped, her lines wandered. On one occasion, she accidentally inserted a recipe for fish brine into a page of the Psalter. It was discovered only years later when the manuscript was sent to a neighboring abbey for binding. The monks there, unaccustomed to culinary surprises in holy texts, sent it back with a polite note. Afternoons brought small freedoms. Weather permitting, the sisters might walk the cloister in pairs, speaking softly or not at all. The sky above Wexford was rarely clear, but occasionally sunlight filtered through the mist, turning the wet flagstones to dull gold. Sister Agnes liked those moments best. She would look up at the tower, at the crows that nested there, and feel a peculiar affection for the ordinary rhythm of things, the slow ticking of prayer and silence, of bells and meals, of rules half remembered and half ignored. The convent cat, a striped creature named Thomas, often followed her. He was not allowed in the chapel, but he went anyway, slipping between robes and settling under pews. Sister Agnes once suggested that Thomas should be blessed, given his devotion. The abbess replied that cats did not require salvation. Agnes nodded, but she continued to leave scraps for him behind the kitchens. Rules were guidelines, she thought, not chains. Winter was the most difficult season. The fires smoked, the roofs dripped, the parchment stiffened in the cold. Frost bloomed on window panes like ferns, beautiful but inconvenient. The sisters wore extra layers beneath their habits, but the cold found its way in regardless. In those months, time seemed to move slower than ever, the days merging into a quiet sameness. Sister Agnes was put in charge of the infirmary during one particularly long winter. She took her duties seriously, though she knew little of medicine. Her main strategy was to keep everyone warm and hydrated. When one of the older sisters developed a persistent cough, Agnes brewed every herbal infusion she could recall: thyme for the chest, honey for the throat, a little vinegar for good measure. The sister recovered by spring, though whether from Agnes's care or divine intervention was uncertain. She wrote letters, too, endlessly polite, exceedingly long letters to neighboring abbeys, to distant bishops, to anyone who could conceivably read them. Most went unanswered. In one, she inquired whether the rule allowed for a small patch of garden to be used for personal contemplation. The reply, months later, was brief: no. Still, she planted violets there the following spring. They were delicate and
short-lived, but their color pleased her. And yet, for all her mild rebellions, Sister Agnes was not disliked. Her sisters found her exasperating, yes, but also oddly comforting. Her mistakes were harmless, her intentions pure. In a world where perfection was the goal, her imperfection made her human. When novices grew anxious under the weight of rules, the abbess would sigh and say, "Do your best. Remember Sister Agnes." The name became a sort of proverb, a gentle reminder that holiness did not require efficiency. In her later years, when her hands trembled too much to write, Sister Agnes was given charge of the novices' instruction. She taught them the prayers, the gestures, the silences. She taught slowly, often pausing mid-sentence, as if listening for some distant sound. "Do not rush," she would tell them. "The Lord is not going anywhere." The novices smiled, uncertain whether this was wisdom or forgetfulness. Sometimes she told stories, not dramatic ones, but soft tales of convent life long past, of a sister who once sneezed during Mass and believed she had broken a vow of silence, of another who tried to paint the virgin robe with crushed lapis and accidentally stained her own fingers blue for weeks. These tales went nowhere, as most good bedtime stories do, ending not with moral lessons, but with small silences. The novices, lulled by her voice, sometimes nodded off during instruction. Sister Agnes never woke them. When she finally grew ill, it happened gradually, like everything else in her life. One morning, she simply did not rise for matins. The abbess, now older and softened by time, went to her cell. Sister Agnes was awake, smiling faintly. The candle beside her burned down to its stub. "I think," she whispered, "I've been late for prayers." It was her last joke. They buried her behind the chapel, near the wall where the violets still grew. For years afterward, no one thought much of her. The convent carried on, bells, prayers, seasons repeating. But her name lingered. When a novice erred, the sisters would exchange knowing glances. "A little bit of Agnes," they'd say. Centuries later,
when the convent's records were examined by a visiting scholar, he found her mentioned only in passing. Sister Agnes, noted for irregular observance. He smiled, made a note, and turned the page. But if he had listened more closely, if he had stood in the cloister at dusk, he might have heard the faintest sound of humming. Not a hymn exactly, something slower, softer, the sort of tune a nun might sing to herself while forgetting quite contentedly what verse came next. Pause. Gentle exhale. And that, dear listener, is the story of Sister Agnes of Wexford, possibly the worst nun in medieval England, and perhaps, in her own way, one of the most peaceful. As you rest now, imagine the quiet rhythm of the convent bell echoing through the fog, calling no one in particular to prayer. Let that sound fade until there is only stillness, until sleep comes, gentle and unhurried. Good evening, listener. If you are still awake, you may allow your breathing to fall in step with the pace of this story. We are still in England, though the year has changed. It is now the early 10th century, and the light over the Midlands is the color of pewter. Somewhere beyond the mist lies the fortified town of Tamworth, and inside one of its timber halls sits a woman with a map, a candle, and a dull headache. Her name is Æthelflæd, daughter of Alfred the Great. She is known in chronicles written long after her death as the Lady of the Mercians. But here, tonight, she is simply Æthelflæd, tired, thoughtful, and cold despite the fire. It has been raining for 3 days. Rain collects in the ruts outside the hall, where pigs root half-heartedly in the mud. The guards at the gate stamp their feet to stay awake. Inside, the air smells of wet wool, smoke, and a faint tang of iron from the weapons hung along the wall. Æthelflæd's mornings begin early, though she is rarely in a hurry. A servant brings porridge that has been left too long by the hearth. She eats it anyway. Someone reads aloud from a list of supplies: grain, salt, spears, more grain. The numbers are approximate. Everything is approximate in Mercia, except the rain, which is endless and exact. The lady listens, nods, and scratches a mark beside each item with the point of a knife. The knife is dull. It leaves grooves rather than lines. When the reading is over, she folds the parchment and sets it aside. There will be more lists tomorrow.
You might imagine a ruler of early medieval England as a figure of drama, issuing commands, riding into battle, draped in shining mail. Æthelflæd's days are mostly meetings. She meets with reeves who cannot agree on the repair of bridges. She meets with monks who argue about the boundaries of a field donated 40 years ago by a man whose name no one remembers. She listens to both sides with the same calm patience, as if she is hearing the tide go out. When she finally speaks, it is in a low, deliberate tone that gives no offense and commits to nothing. The monks leave satisfied. The reeves leave uncertain. The bridges remain unrepaired. After the morning petitions, she walks the perimeter of the burh. The walls are earthen, topped with timber, lined with brush to stop the wind. Soldiers nod as she passes. One of them sneezes. She nods back. Outside the walls, small farms spread in every direction. Winter wheat, a few goats, a boy chasing a chicken. The air carries the smell of wood smoke from a dozen hearths. It is, she reflects, a smell she has known all her life. Her father's court at Winchester had smelled the same, though richer somehow, as if ambition itself had a scent. When she returns to the hall, someone is waiting with a letter from her brother, King Edward. The letter is long, and the handwriting is stern. It advises her to build more fortifications, to collect more men, to be vigilant against the Danes. She reads it twice, folds it neatly, and places it beneath a small wooden cross on her table. The cross wobbles slightly. She straightens it and sighs. The Danes will come when they wish, and they will leave when they must. At midday, the rain stops. The silence it leaves behind is so sudden that the guards glance up, as if the world has misstepped. Æthelflæd takes advantage of the calm to walk to the church, a small stone building that smells of lime and damp cloth. She kneels on the cold floor and prays not for victory, but for patience. Outside, a sparrow hops across the threshold, shakes the water from its feathers, and departs without comment. The lady watches it go, then crosses herself and rises slowly. Her knees ache. She thinks briefly of her mother, Æthelflæd, who had warned her that prayer was hardest on the joints. Afternoons in Tamworth are long. There are letters to answer, inventories to approve, small disputes over grazing rights. The scribe's quills scratch endlessly, like mice in the walls. Sometimes she dictates, sometimes she listens, sometimes she allows her mind to wander. It drifts toward memories. Her husband, Æthelflæd, now long dead, the years of illness that dulled him before the end, the quiet relief of solitude that followed his passing. Widowhood, she has discovered, is both freedom and burden. The court expects firmness. The church expects modesty. Her people expect miracles. She provides none, only steadiness. In the evenings there are messengers. They bring news of Viking movements, of markets raided along the Severn, of monks requesting permission to relocate relics yet again. Each report is delivered with nervous energy, as if speed might make the facts less troublesome. Æthelflæd thanks them, dismisses them, and returns to her seat by the fire. She eats slowly. Bread, a little cheese, sometimes a handful of dried apples. She drinks watered ale and watches the flames lean toward the draught. Around her, conversation hums, soldiers murmuring, servants whispering, the occasional laugh quickly stifled. She listens without listening, her thoughts turning like the embers. When night finally closes around the hall, she retires to her chamber. The walls are hung with woven cloths depicting lions that look faintly apologetic. Her bed is narrow, the blanket coarse. She removes her rings one by one, sets them on the table, and blows out the candle. The darkness is complete. Outside, the rain begins again, gentle this time, a familiar rhythm against the roof. Sleep comes slowly, as it always does, arriving only when she stops waiting for it. The next day is much the same. A letter from Chester, a rumor from York, a broken cartwheel near Stafford. The world continues to demand her attention,
and she continues to give it, calmly and without hurry. Some call her cautious, others call her wise. She considers herself simply thorough. She approves the building of another fort along the river, not because she expects invasion, but because the workers need something to do. Idle hands, she tells her steward, are dangerous in winter. He nods solemnly, writes it down as if it were scripture, and goes to find the carpenters. By evening, plans are drawn, timbers measured, ropes cut to length. No one remarks that the same fort was proposed and abandoned the year before. The seasons turn. Spring brings mud. Summer brings flies. Autumn brings accounts of harvests, mostly adequate.
Through it all, Æthelflæd endures, unremarkable in her constancy. Her rule stretches not in triumphs, but in lists, fortifications completed, disputes settled, taxes collected, prayers said. Her chronicler, a patient monk named Oswald, writes these events in a narrow script that tilts slightly to the left. He includes every date, every minor skirmish, every donation to the church. Reading his record aloud would take longer than the events themselves. It pleases her. Accuracy, after all, is a kind of prayer. Occasionally, envoys from the north arrive, Norsemen seeking truce or pretending to. They are large men with pale eyes and polite smiles. Æthelflæd receives them in the hall, where the ceiling drips slightly despite repairs. She listens to their proposals while her steward translates. When they finish, she nods, pauses, and replies in careful Old English that they almost understand. The words are few, but the tone leaves little doubt. There will be peace if peace is possible, and war if it is not. The envoys nod equally slow and drink the thin ale offered to them. Later they depart, taking the muddy road east. The lady watches until their banners disappear into the mist, then returns to her work. There are always letters. Years pass quietly. Her hair fades from gold to silver. Her hands stiffen. Her eyes narrow at small print. She moves through her duties as one moves through prayer, not seeking reward, only rhythm. Under her rule, Mercia holds steady. It is not a dramatic victory, merely an absence of failure. For chroniclers, this poses a problem. Peace is difficult to record. They note her firmness, her piety, her wisdom, then run out of adjectives. One writes simply, "She governed well and without noise." It is the highest praise she will ever receive. Toward the end of her life, she travels to Gloucester to oversee the building of a new church. The journey is slow, the roads uneven, the air thick with midsummer dust. At night, she stays in a small hall along the way, listening to frogs in the marshes and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Her companions sleep. She remains awake, counting the faint flicker of stars through a smoke hole. She wonders whether her father, Alfred, ever truly rested. She suspects not. Leadership, she decides, is an extended form of wakefulness. In Gloucester, she oversees the laying of the church's foundation stone. The ceremony is long, the prayers longer. The bishop coughs midway through his sermon, but carries on bravely. Æthelflæd stands throughout, leaning slightly on a staff, expression unreadable. When the final blessing is given, she nods once and steps forward to place a single coin upon the stone. The crowd murmurs approval. A mason covers the coin with mortar, and the work resumes. It is a small moment, but one that will be remembered long after her name fades.
That evening she writes in her journal, a habit she keeps not for history, but for sleep. Her entries are brief and without flourish. The wall is straight, the lime is good, rain tomorrow perhaps. She closes the book, sets it beside the bed, and lies down. Her last conscious thought is of the river outside, turning slowly under the moon. When she dies, it happens without announcement, in her sleep, in a hall that smells faintly of oak and ashes. Her attendants find her at dawn, hands folded, expression calm. The sun, thin and pale, filters through the shutters, landing across her face like a benediction. The bells of Gloucester toll slowly, not triumphant, not sorrowful, merely steady. The sound rolls across the fields, over the half-built walls, through the quiet streets of Tamworth. People pause, listen, and then continue with their tasks. Life, as she knew, rarely stops. The chroniclers will later write that under Æthelflæd, the Lady of the Mercians, peace returned to the Midlands. They will omit the rain, the paperwork, the headaches, the long silences. They will forget that history can be built from monotony as well as from glory. But you, listener, may remember her differently, as a woman who kept the world from falling apart simply by showing up every day. Now, as you rest, imagine the quiet patter of rain against wooden walls, the steady breath of a sleeping land, and the faint, slow tolling of a distant bell. Let it fade. Let it all fade.
The Corrupt Abbess. If you are still with us, still awake but not entirely, that is all right. You may allow this story to drift around you the way incense fills a chapel. No need to follow every detail. No need to remember every name. Just listen and breathe and imagine the slow turning of centuries. Our story now moves to another convent, this one older, poorer, and slightly lopsided in both design and reputation. It was called St. Mildred's of Shaftley, though locals referred to it simply as the Crooked Abbey. It leaned a little toward the east, as if trying to bow. The walls had been repaired so many times that no two stones agreed on color. From a distance, it looked respectable. Up close, it looked tired. Inside these walls ruled Abbess Matilda, a woman both admired and avoided. She had been elected not for holiness, nor even competence, but for persistence. After 20 years of outlasting rivals, she was the only candidate still standing. Abbess Matilda began each day the same way. She woke before dawn, sighed heavily, and rang the bell for prayer. Sometimes the bell rope caught on the beam, and she had to tug 3 or 4 times before sound emerged. When it finally did, it was more of a groan than a ring, low, uneven, and reluctant. The sisters rose, rubbing their eyes, and shuffled to the chapel. Matilda followed last, her candle flickering in the draught. The prayers were long, the candles short, and the floor perpetually cold. Matilda recited the Psalms with dutiful accuracy, though her mind often wandered toward breakfast, which she knew would be mostly barley bread and air. When the final Amen faded into the rafters, she returned to her chamber, where a small ledger waited beside a nearly empty ink pot. Bookkeeping was her true vocation, though she had never mastered arithmetic. Over the years, Matilda had developed her own accounting system, one that owed more to faith than to numbers. Columns of figures were replaced by symbols. A cross meant paid.
A small circle meant expected. A larger circle meant hoped for. Her steward once suggested hiring a clerk, but she found that idea unsettling. If anyone else could read her system, they might also question it. The convent's finances were therefore a mystery, even to God. Tithes arrived irregularly, rents were collected selectively, and the abbey's hens laid fewer eggs each year, as if protesting economic policy. Still, nothing collapsed outright. That, to Matilda, was success. Visitors occasionally arrived from the bishop's office, carrying scrolls, questions, and expressions of mild suspicion. They always found the same things: polite hospitality, endless paperwork, and no clear evidence of wrongdoing. One such visitor, a thin man named Brother Henry, once spent 3 days examining accounts and came away none the wiser. He wrote in his report, "The abbess is competent or else blessed by chaos." It was the most accurate description ever written of her rule. Matilda's reputation for corruption was born not of greed, but of disorganization. She accepted gifts from wealthy patrons and promptly forgot about them. She lent money to poor tenants and forgot that, too. When accused of mismanagement, she blinked slowly and said, "The Lord's will is sometimes untidy." No one could argue with that. The sisters of Æthelflæd tolerated their abbess with weary affection. They admired her patience, feared her memory lapses, and pitied her taste in architecture. Every year she launched a new renovation, a roof here, a cloister there, each left half-finished when funds or interest ran out. The abbey, as a result, was a patchwork of intentions. One wing boasted new windows, another had none at all. A painter hired to decorate the chapel ceiling stopped after 3 saints, declaring himself inspired but exhausted. The 4th saint was outlined but never filled in, hovering eternally in limbo. In her defense, Matilda believed she was improving the place. Whenever cracks appeared in the walls, she called for plaster. When the plaster fell off, she called for prayer. And when prayer failed, she called for more plaster. It was a cycle both spiritual and practical. Her greatest scandal began with the arrival of a barrel of wine. It was a gift from a merchant's widow, meant for use in Mass. Unfortunately, it was delivered on a Friday, when the sisters were fasting. Matilda, ever pragmatic, declared that wasting good wine would be sinful. She ordered the barrel opened and distributed for medicinal use. By Vespers, half of the convent was singing psalms with unusual enthusiasm. By midnight, one sister was loudly debating the theology of chickens. The next morning, silence returned, heavy, embarrassed silence. The abbess issued a statement that the incident had been an experiment in joy. The bishop was informed. His response, written weeks later, was brief: "Cease all experiments."
Her leadership, though chaotic, was not without moments of peculiar wisdom. When famine struck nearby villages, she ordered the convent granaries opened. Her steward objected that this would leave them with little for winter. Matilda replied that hunger was louder than gratitude, and she preferred quiet. The grain was given, the villages survived, and the sisters spent the winter eating thin soup flavored with prayer and sarcasm. They survived too. If you were to visit St. Mildred's in those years, you would notice certain patterns. The walls leaned slightly inward, as if confiding in one another. The courtyard smelled faintly of cabbage and wax.
In the refectory, a tapestry depicting the Last Supper hung at an angle, Jesus perpetually sliding toward the corner. And in the chapel, the great crucifix swayed ever so gently when the wind blew through the roof tiles. It was not majestic, but it was sincere. Matilda herself was a small woman with a large presence. Her habit was perpetually wrinkled, her veil never quite straight. She walked with purpose, but often forgot where she was going halfway there. When young novices confessed their doubts, she told them that doubt was simply faith taking a nap. When older nuns complained about cold floors, she reminded them that suffering built character. No one argued, but everyone wore extra socks. In her quieter moments, she wrote letters, long rambling appeals for donations or indulgences. Her handwriting was generous, her spelling adventurous. She often forgot to include the recipient's name, which forced her messengers to guess. One such letter, meant for the Bishop of Winchester, ended up in the hands of a baker in Bath. The baker, amused, sent back a loaf of bread as a tithe. Matilda considered it divine approval and recorded the bread as income. Over time, rumors of her eccentric management spread beyond Shaftesbury. Some said she had hidden gold under the altar. Others claimed she had secretly married a monk. Both were untrue, though the truth was stranger. She had once accidentally excommunicated herself by signing a letter twice. When the error was discovered, she appealed for absolution, which arrived after 6 months and much laughter in the bishop's court. The story earned her a new nickname among the clergy, Matilda the Twice Blessed. She pretended to find it offensive, but secretly enjoyed it. Her final years were marked by serenity and mildew. She spent more time in the garden, less in the accounts. The herb beds flourished under her neglect, spreading freely into the paths. She claimed this represented divine abundance. The sisters called it weeds. Either way, the convent smelled pleasantly of time and disobedience. When she could no longer manage the ledgers, she passed them to her steward with a sigh. He opened the first page, stared, and said, "Mother, these numbers do not add up." Matilda smiled faintly. She said, "Then they are honest." On the evening of her last day, a storm rolled in from the coast. Rain struck the roof in heavy, uneven rhythms. Candles sputtered, gutters overflowed, and the chapel door creaked like a prayer unanswered. Matilda sat by the window, watching lightning crawl across the clouds. A novice entered to ask whether the roof might collapse. Matilda replied, "Everything collapses, child, just not all at once." Then she closed her eyes and dozed. By morning, the storm had passed, and so had she. The sisters found her still seated, hands folded in her lap, face serene. The window beside her was open. A small puddle glimmered on the sill. They buried her behind the abbey, under the leaning wall she had never quite repaired. When spring came, wildflowers grew from the cracks, yellow, white, and stubborn. Years later, the bishop ordered an audit of St. Mildred's. The new abbess presented the old ledgers with pride. After a long silence, the bishop closed the book and said, "It is a miracle this place exists." The abbess agreed. "Some miracles," she added, "are mostly paperwork." And so the crooked abbey continued, half ruin, half refuge,
forever balanced between faith and confusion. And Abbess Matilda, remembered as corrupt, perhaps deserved a kinder word. For while her books were false, her heart was true, and her greatest crime was believing that God would sort it all out in the end. And now, listener, you may rest. Imagine the faint sound of rain on uneven tiles, the smell of old parchment and lavender, and the slow breathing of a world at peace with its own imperfection. Let the sound of the abbey's bell fade into the dark, one uneven chime at a time.
Mad monks and failed saints. Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. Let your shoulders sink. Listen to the quiet, the way it holds the air around you. Tonight, we walk again into the Middle Ages, not among kings or warriors, but among monks who prayed too loudly, saints who never quite became saints, and ordinary men who mistook persistence for enlightenment. In the year 1128, at an abbey on the edge of the North Sea, there lived a monk named Brother Alaric. He was tall, thin, and perpetually worried. Not about sin, as most monks were, but about seagulls. He believed sincerely that the birds were messengers of the devil. When they gathered on the roof, he rang the chapel bell until they scattered. The other monks complained, but Alaric said he could not risk temptation descending in feathered form. His superior, Prior Stephen, tried reasoning with him. "The gulls are creatures of God," he said. "So was the serpent," Alaric replied, and that ended the discussion. Over time, Brother Alaric's vigilance against birds expanded to include shadows, wind, and certain colors. He claimed the devil could appear in the shade of a cloud or the sheen of a fish's scale. When he died, peacefully in his sleep, the abbey bell did not ring for him. The brothers feared the gulls might misunderstand. Even in death, Alaric was a man best left undisturbed. Further inland, in a monastery built near the ruins of an old Roman bathhouse, another peculiar soul thrived. His name was Brother Odo. He fancied himself a reformer, a visionary who believed the monastic rule too lenient. He fasted to the point of fainting, prayed until his knees swelled, and slept on bare stone. When novices asked why he lived this way, Odo replied that comfort was the first step toward damnation. They nodded, but quietly continued using blankets. One winter, convinced that sleep was a form of spiritual weakness, Odo tried to pray continuously for 40 nights. By the 3rd week, he was speaking in tongues. By the 5th week, he was conversing with the rafters. The abbey physician declared it divine exhaustion. The abbot called it progress. After his passing, they found notes scribbled in the margins of his psalter. "Beware of pillows, they make the soul soft." His writing survived for a time, passed between monasteries as an example of holy intensity. Eventually, they were used to start fires in the kitchen. The monks said it was fitting, his words at last providing warmth. In another corner of Christendom, near the forests of Saxony,
lived a man known as Brother Wilhelm the Silent. He was not born silent. He simply stopped speaking one day and never resumed. Some said he had taken a vow. Others believed he had simply run out of useful things to say. He communicated through gestures, nods, and occasional elaborate drawings in the dust. The monks adapted to his wordless ways. When he wanted salt, he mimed the sea. When he wanted water, he mimed drowning. When he wanted peace, he simply walked away. Years passed, and his silence became legendary. Pilgrims came from distant lands to witness the monk who spoke only to God. They left disappointed. God, too, seemed to keep his distance. One spring, Wilhelm disappeared into the forest. When he did not return, the brothers assumed he had found solitude everlasting. Years later, a shepherd found his cell deep among the trees, a small wooden hut filled with neat rows of polished stones. No one understood their meaning. Perhaps they were prayers, perhaps just rocks. These were not men of malice. These were men of too much devotion, turned inward until reason itself grew thin. And yet, the medieval world loved them for it. Madness, after all, was often mistaken for holiness. The thinner the line between them, the more the chroniclers approved. Not all tales of failure were so tranquil. Consider the life of Saint Ambrosius the Unfinished. He was never formally canonized, though he came close on 3 occasions. Each time, his miracles proved temporary. Once, he supposedly turned water into wine, until it rained and the barrels refilled themselves with water again. Another time, he healed a blind man who later admitted he had never been blind, only nearsighted. The final straw came when Ambrosius promised to end a drought by praying for 40 days. It rained on the 39th day. The bishops, impressed by the effort, but wary of precision, declared him almost a saint. His cult persisted for decades among the faithful who appreciated mediocrity. His feast day, celebrated only in his home village, involved drinking half a cup of watered wine and leaving tasks half done in his honor.
Then there was Brother Petrus the Round, so named for his shape and his fondness for cheese. He founded an order devoted to the philosophy that joy, properly managed, could lead to salvation. His monastery was famous for its laughter, its well-fed brothers, and its frequent naps. Pilgrims called them the happy monks of Haverly. The church called them a distraction. In 1221, the order was quietly dissolved. The brothers dispersed, taking their recipes with them. Centuries later, their legacy survived only as a local dish, a round loaf stuffed with herbs and cheese. The villagers, unaware of its origin, called it St. Petrus's belly. A different kind of failure plagued Sister Euphemia, a would-be saint whose visions were frequent but inconvenient. She claimed to see angels in mundane places, in the bakery, in the privy, in the reflection of spoons. At first, her sisters listened kindly, but when she began describing celestial messages about laundry schedules and soup recipes, patience thinned. One night, during matins, she interrupted the chant to announce that the Virgin Mary disapproved of lentils. The abbess, unimpressed, told her to fast until the message changed. It never did. Euphemia eventually retired to a small cell where she spent her days rewriting hymns in simpler words. Her final composition, The Humble Pot and the Holy Spoon, survived only as a footnote in a larger volume. There is a comfort, perhaps, in these imperfect lives. For every grand saint who raised the dead or converted kingdoms, there were a dozen minor figures who merely kept going. They prayed, they stumbled, they misunderstood divine instructions, and the world went on. Their failures, small and persistent, became part of the quiet fabric of the age. At the monastery of St. Luke, chroniclers once attempted to record all minor miracles, the kind that never made it to Rome. They listed a loaf that did not burn, a storm that changed direction, and a donkey that refused to bray during prayer. The manuscript ended abruptly after the entry, "Brother Thomas claims to have seen a halo on his own reflection. Investigation ongoing." No conclusion was ever added. Perhaps the investigation continues centuries later, in someone's dream. The medieval world was full of such investigations, inquiries into faith, sanity, and the uncertain border between them. Monks debated whether laughter was sinful, whether hiccups were demonic, whether yawning during prayer counted as sloth. One abbot declared that excessive blinking was a form of distraction and ordered his monks to practice stillness of the eyelids. No one succeeded, but they tried earnestly, and that was enough. Another abbot, far to the south, banned singing after compline because he believed joy interfered with contemplation. The monks obeyed until he fell asleep. Then, quietly, they sang lullabies to each other in the dark. Some rules are too fragile to survive kindness. Not all monks went mad alone. There were collective fits, shared visions, and outbreaks of ecstatic dancing that baffled chroniclers. At one abbey in Burgundy, the brothers reportedly danced for 3 days after a barrel of honey burst open in the cellar. The abbot declared it a miracle. The physician declared it food poisoning. Either way, the records note that morale improved. In another case, a group of hermits attempted to live without speaking for a full year. After 3 weeks, they began communicating in exaggerated sighs. By month 2, the sighs had become musical. By winter, they were humming psalms in harmony, which the bishop later approved as nonverbal praise. History rarely distinguishes between failure and adaptation. And somewhere, beyond all these small absurdities, lies the heart of it. The quiet endurance of belief. To live in a world of plagues, wars, and endless winters, and still believe that the divine might notice you, that was its own miracle. Mad monks and failed saints were not embarrassments. They were proof that the search for meaning continued even in confusion. Perhaps that is why the chroniclers recorded them at all, to remind us that faith need not be perfect to be sincere, that holiness can look like hesitation or laughter, or someone mistaking seagulls for demons. And so, listener, if you are still asleep, think of these strange, gentle men and women, not mad, not divine, simply human in their longing for purpose. Picture the candlelight trembling against the stone walls,
the echo of sandals fading down a cold corridor, the faint scent of wax and time. They lived, they prayed, they failed, and the world kept turning. May their quiet persistence lull you toward rest now, as the bells of a long-crumbled monastery toll once more in the distance, softly, endlessly, for no one in particular.
And so the stories end. The nun who disobeyed in silence, the ruler who built her walls against the dark, the abbess who counted coins instead of prayers. They all fade now into the long quiet of history. For every name remembered, 1,000 more have vanished. Their lives were small, ordinary, filled with weather and work and weary faith. They never imagined that centuries later anyone would whisper their names aloud again. The stones of their convents have crumbled, the ink on their letters has long turned brown, but the rhythm of their days, bells, prayers, footsteps, silence, still lingers somewhere in the places where time slows down. Maybe that is all history ever becomes, a faint echo of ordinary people doing ordinary things in extraordinary times. If you are still awake, thank you for listening, for walking quietly through the long corridors of the past. And if you've drifted away somewhere between one century and the next, that's perfectly all right. You've joined them in the hush they left behind. This has been Mild History, where nothing is rushed and everything fades gently into quiet. Sleep well, traveler, dream softly, and remember, even the smallest life once lived was part of something vast.